Appalachian Mountains and this river, the Mississippi, were two great natural barriers to westward expansion. The first was breached after the Revolutionary War. Settlers, following on the heels of Daniel Boone, passed through the Cumberland Gap into the rich lands beyond. After the War of 1812, a few settlers began crossing the Mississippi. By the 1830s and 40s, the few had become a multitude. Thousands of pioneers and settlers crossed this river, and in long wagon trains moved out onto the great prairies. Daniel Boone would have been amazed at the distances contemplated by his grandchildren. One group moved southwest, toward the fertile lands of Texas and beyond them to Santa Fe. Others moved northwest, toward the Oregon Territory, nearly 2,000 miles away. Who were these people? New Englanders escaping from exhausted farms. Carolinians and Tennesseans displaced by plantation and cotton society. Irish, German, and other immigrants seeking a new start. They were all seeking their dream in the West, the cheapest and easiest place to begin anew. Some of them were caricatured back east as unscrupulous traders and frontier ruffians. Some were. One historian says many of these people left their country for their country's own good. Reports drifted east of knife fights, eye-gouging brawls, and in general, drunken and swinish behavior. Some of the more salty pioneers fessed up to these exploits. They called themselves ring-tailed roarers, half horse and half alligator. On the other hand, those who did settle down seemed more organized than those first pioneers who had crossed the Appalachians. Farms were quickly laid out. Villages and towns sprang up in dizzying rapidity with little regard for the natural resources. They were quicker to organize some kind of government. This process of westward expansion was a remarkable event. The phenomenon had been noticed a few years earlier by the last French governor of Louisiana, who described the spectacle.
They set up their huts, cut and burn the timber, kill the savages or are killed by them. They disappear from the country either by dying or ceding to some steadfast cultivator the land they have already begun to clear. When a score of new colonists are thus gathered on a certain spot, they are followed by two printers, then by doctors, lawyers, and adventurers. They propose toasts and nominate a speaker. They erect a city. They begat children without end. They advertise vast territories for sale. They attract and deceive as many buyers as possible. They increase the figures of the population till they reach a total of 60,000 souls, at which time they are able to form an independent state and send a representative to Congress. And there's one more star in the United States flag.
The results of this great surge west by American settlers were devastating for those in its path. The Native Americans were swept aside with callous indifference. Hispanic settlers' rights were ignored. Great Britain had to give up part of the Oregon Territory, but the highest price for the American expansion westward was paid by the Republic of Mexico. The price began here at Palo Alto Battlefield near Brownsville, Texas. This is near the place where the first blood was spilled in a war between Mexico and the United States. It ended with Mexico losing 1/3 of its territory, causing thousands of Hispanics to lose their national identity. The war broke out in 1846, but just a few years earlier, the two countries had been friends. After its War of Independence, the United States became an admired model for Mexico. When that country gained its independence from Spain in 1821, it modeled its constitution on its northern neighbors. The two republics, the United States and Mexico, congratulated each other. It seemed they would share the continent in peace. But within a few years, hostilities had broken out. How did it happen? Mexico wanted to develop Tejas, its northernmost province. So the government offered land grants to people who would bring in settlers. In 1823, Stephen F. Austin led 3,000 families into Tejas, or Texas. Soon, thousands of others, mostly Southerners, were streaming across the border. There were culture clashes. Most Mexicans spoke Spanish. That was the official language of the country, but most Americans spoke only English. Mexicans were Catholic, but most Americans were Protestant. The Mexican court system had no trial by jury. Instead, cases were decided by a judge. This didn't seem fair to Americans. In 1828, when Mexico abolished slavery, Texans continued to violate the law by keeping their slaves and bringing in more. In an attempt to subdue the rebellious Texans, in 1836, General Santa Anna marched north with 6,000 men and defeated 187 Texans at the Battle of the Alamo in San Antonio. Revenge was taken 6 weeks later at the Battle of San Jacinto. There, the Mexicans were defeated and Santa Anna captured. Texas declared its independence and set up the Republic of Texas. Mexico refused to recognize the new republic, but was too weak to attack it. That's the way things stood as the election of 1844 approached. In town meetings, in country stores and blacksmith shops, people swapped news and commented on the candidates and the issues. The Whigs nominated their most popular man, Henry Clay of Kentucky. The Democrats nominated the first dark horse in American political history. A dark horse was a candidate who was not expected to be nominated, but received unexpected support. When people heard the name of the dark horse, they seemed astounded. They exclaimed,
James K. Polk? Who in the world is James K. Polk? What does he stand for? What does he know about politics? Old neighbor Tom is right comical about Polk. He claims that even the raccoons at his place run around grinning and singing. He says they sing, ha, 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 what a nominee is James K. Polk of Tennessee.
Yeah, that Tom is a caution. Now listen, Polk didn't come down in the latest shower of rain. He's been in the government in Washington, and I like what he says.
Yeah?
He wants Texas, the Oregon Territory, and the United States to expand to the other ocean. That's clear and direct.
Well, I allow it is. Poor old Clay has been a puzzle here. He says he was for annexing Texas, then he said he wasn't, then he said he was. Maybe. He's clear enough on other things. National currency, them tariff laws, limiting the president to a single term. But people don't give a continental about those things right now.
Well, that's a fact. What I want to know is, are we or are we not gonna rule this here American continent? From what I read and hear, most people say we should.
Yeah.
Now, here's a bunch of newspaper stories. I don't understand it all, but the general meaning is pretty clear. Listen to this.
Yeah, read it.
Young nations are like living creatures. They must grow or die. Natural boundaries must be reached. Undeveloped lands cannot morally be left untended. The benefits of democracy must be brought to those who do not know them.
Well, I declare, that sounds sensible. Wait, here's another. In Europe, men are too close together. The best minds are pressed down without the power of free exertion. This results in riots and rebellions. Here we want almost unlimited power of expansion. That is our safety valve.
I'll be dog, that's good, a safety valve.
Safety valve. In the new world of the West, the smartest people can turn their energy to the work of creation.
Right.
They can turn woods and forests into towns, villages, and cultivated fields.
Well, that's us to the life.
Yep.
Here's one by that Senator Benton from Missouri. He is long-winded, but he writes right powerful.
Yeah.
I know of no human event, past or present, which promises a greater benefit upon earth than the arrival of the Caucasian. Well, plague take it, what's that?
Well, that's us, white people.
Caucasian race upon the border of the sea which washes the shore of Eastern Asia.
That's Pacific Ocean.
I know that. It seems that the white race alone received the divine command to subdue and replenish the earth.
this is powerful and high-toned talk, and it seems many people believed it completely and passionately. There was comment about manifest destiny, divine right, inexorable urges. It was as though the American settler and his family were obeying some cosmic command of nature. The American populace could not rest until the Pacific coast of California had been reached. I needed more information to better understand this urge. So I visited Professor Jack Bauer of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute to ask him why Americans thought they had the right to trample over the rights of others in attempting to extend the borders of the American nation?
Well, I think the first thing, Ron, we ought to realize is in the 1840s, the Americans did not consider they were trampling on the rights of other nations. What they saw, at least the hypothetical American of that era, really thought that the United States represented the wave of the future. The American way was the system, the socioeconomic and political system that was the great hope of mankind. And therefore that we had a mission to extend that system to the rest of the world, and particularly to the Latin Americans, who we viewed as our protégés. To the Americans who supported the war with Mexico, particularly in the South and the West, the idea that Texas and New Mexico and California were Mexican was immaterial, because these were areas which the Mexicans had not exploited, and which, in the view of the American of that period, needed the United States and needed the American way to be totally developed. And therefore that for the Americans, this was a very logical, proper way to do. Indeed, from their standpoint, to be backward, to be ruled by despots and priests, and to have the natural wealth which God had given the area not exploited was not a right. It was indeed a sin. So I think from this standpoint, the Americans of that era really did not think they were trampling on the rights of Mexico.
And so James K. Polk won the election of 1844, and events moved quickly now. Texas became a state in the Union. As good as his word, Polk forced the settlement of the Oregon question with Great Britain. The new boundaries agreed upon between Canada and the United States are the ones that exist now. Polk also wanted Upper California and New Mexico. He offered to buy the land, but the Mexicans refused. Would Polk care to sell them one of the United States, they wondered? But the president was not called Polk the Purposeful for nothing. He wanted the area, and he had a plan. In January of 1846, he ordered General Zachary Taylor to move from the Nueces River to here on the north bank of the Rio Grande. Mexico had never accepted the Texas claim that its territory extended to the Rio Grande. Mexican troops eventually crossed the Rio Grande and attacked Taylor's forces here on this field. Polk immediately asked Congress to declare war on Mexico. Most of the people approved, but not all. In the Northeast, many regarded the war as scandalous and shameful. Religious groups said it was immoral to support a war that would extend slavery into new territory. Henry David Thoreau refused to pay his taxes and was thrown into jail. Daniel Webster condemned the war. He said that Polk had usurped the power of Congress. But these protests were overwhelmed by the enthusiastic acclaim as the United States forces in Mexico won victory after victory. The war with Mexico was the first time Americans had fought on foreign soil, except for the brief and unfortunate raids into Canada. The first thrust was made from here by General Zachary Taylor. He soon defeated a Mexican army at the Battle of Monterrey. An even more able general commanded the American thrust toward Mexico City itself. This was led by General Winfield Scott. His vanity and his attention to discipline won him the nickname of Old Fuss and Feathers. But he led the first military amphibious operation in American history. General Scott assembled a fleet of 200 ships carrying 10,000 men off the Mexican coast at Veracruz. Within 24 hours, all the men were off the ship, on land, and without a single casualty. Military experts say it was the start of the most unusual and successful military campaign in American history. But the troops on board the ships off Veracruz had no idea how things would go. They watched the land intently. And like all troops going into battle, some prayed, others looked forward to the action with varying degrees of enthusiasm.
It was a bright, clear March afternoon. The signal to disembark came when the setting sun touched the snow-capped Mount Orizaba, clearly visible 50 miles away. When the sun, like a red ball, hit the snowy peak, from our ship, the Massachusetts, came the flash of a signal gun. We went over the side, climbed down rope ladders into the little surf boats. As we pulled for shore, we expected to hear the U.S. shells going over us toward the shore. But all we heard were the splash of oars and the Star-Spangled Banner. It perked up my spirits, I can tell you.
I kept thinking, why don't they shoot? The town was black with people watching from the housetops and hills. There were a few shots from some Mexican lancers cantering along the beach, but they soon took off. We hit the beach a few miles from the town itself. We waded in, and we run up the sand to the first sand dune. We planted a pole and raised the flag. We all burst into cheers. By midnight, we were eating pork and biscuit, pleased as punch.
But the picnic soon ended. After a successful siege of Veracruz, we had before us the long climb up to the plain of Mexico, to Mexico City. Some of those passes were 10,000 feet high. After we got to Puebla, about 150 miles inland, General Scott decided that our supply lines back to the ships were too long. They were too vulnerable to attacks. So he decided to make us a self-sustaining machine. We had to carry everything on our backs and live off the land. So on a hot August day, we started out for Mexico City. It was another 100 miles and seemed like it was straight up or straight down. We carried a full field pack, guns and ammunition on our backs. It was a nightmare. It was hell.
Just before we reached Mexico City, I nearly met my maker. There was a terrible battle. There were 6,000 of us against 18,000 Mexicans. We fought our way up a mountain and over the top. We were fighting really at the cannon's mouth. Finally, we fought hand to hand with our swords. We lost many men. But on the morning of September 14th, we heard that Santa Anna had abandoned the capital. We entered Mexico City and formed up in a great square before the cathedral. From there, we could see the palace of Chapultepec up on the hill, where we saw the stars and stripes flying high. The band burst out with some lively music, and we yelled ourselves hoarse. It was the most thrilling moment of my life.
Standing here in that great square in Mexico City and in front of the cathedral, it's easy for me to imagine that scene. It was an incredible victory, and some experts were astonished. Scott's decision to have soldiers take only what they needed and live off the land had important consequences in years later. It is said that it influenced Grant's approach to Vicksburg, and later, Sherman's march through Georgia in the Civil War. Part of the American success in Mexico, truthfully, was due to poor Mexican leadership and to deep divisions within Mexican society. But this is not to say that the Mexican soldiers did not fight well. They did, many desperately and to the very end. But they were overwhelmed, basically, by good American officers. Scott had the cream of West Point. The Mexican War was a training ground for most of the general officers of the Civil War. Many of the American soldiers in the Mexican War were volunteers, who by all accounts were a disgrace to the nation. General Scott himself admitted that they had committed atrocities to make heaven weep and every American of Christian morals blush for his country. Rape, robbery, and murder of civilians occurred often. The outrages were bitterly resented. The Mexican newspapers characterized the soldiers as the horde of banditti, of drunkards, of fornicators, vandals vomited from hell, bad-smelling, long-bearded men with hats turned up at the brim, thirsty with the desire to appropriate our riches and our damsels. Of course, back in the States, the South and the West were wild with delight over the victory. There was talk of making Scott president. He had arranged for the peace treaty to be signed in the town of Guadalupe Hidalgo. According to the treaty, Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as its boundary with Texas. The United States received a huge amount of land, including New Mexico and California. In all, Mexico lost about a third of its territory. In return, it received $15 million. To understand the significance of the treaty, I went again to see Professor Bauer. I was interested in finding out if the Mexican War was really just a shameful example of a more powerful nation boldly robbing a weaker one. What did the war and the terms of the treaty really represent?
Well, the war, I think we have to realize, came about because of the conflict of a essentially irresistible American movement west, which we normally call the westward movement, coming up against and spilling over onto Mexican land at a point at which the Mexican government, Mexican political leadership, refused to countenance any loss of territory. And therefore, they were willing to go to war rather than negotiate any kind of a settlement with the Colossus to the north. Unfortunately, James K. Polk did not understand this was the basis of Mexican policy. And he believed that if he applied enough pressure to Mexico, the Mexican government would recognize that that it had to make concessions. What he got instead was a Mexican government which decided it had to fight rather than come to the negotiating table. Even when the war began, Polk tried essentially the same policy in his military strategy of taking northern Mexico and expecting the Mexicans to negotiate. Despite American seizure of northern Mexico, of New Mexico itself, and of California, the Mexican government refused to talk. It forced Polk to stage a second campaign, Winfield Scott's campaign in central Mexico, which went on to take Mexico City. At that point, as negotiations begin to take place to get the war at an end, the Mexicans are in a position of stalemate. They cannot defend the territory they have. The United States, or the Polk administration, I should say, did not have enough support for its war at that moment to raise the additional troops necessary to occupy more of Mexico. And therefore, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a treaty that really was negotiated with the idea of determining what was the minimum price that Mexico would have to pay to get out of the war. The minimum price which would be acceptable to Polk and to the American public. And I think you have to remember at this point that the American public, whether or not it supported the war, generally believed that the war had been...
Here we are at a parking lot at the only place in America where 4 states come together: Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. This is part of the land won from Old Mexico. The 1840s were an extraordinary time in American history. Within the presidency of one man, James K. Polk, the United States won a diplomatic victory over Great Britain and a military one with Mexico. This added about 1,300,000 square miles to the United States. About this time, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow composed a poem that seemed to reflect the national mood of pride, enthusiasm, and love of country. In 1849, when it was published, Americans responded with a thrilled realization of who they were and what they might become when they heard, "Thou too, sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." It was a thrilling poem to match a thrilling time. But the war left legacies the nation had yet to face, and dark, foreboding problems. For the moment, most were in a jubilant mood as the American ship of state plunged boldly ahead toward its fate.
The preceding program was funded in part by Frito-Lay.